Hi, I'm Lindsay Reiser, and the Federal Reserve released its latest policy decision on interest rates today, saying they will remain unchanged for now. As expected, rates will hold steady at 3.5 to 3.75%, where they have been since January. And the decision comes amid concerns over surging oil prices related to the war with Iran, as well as an unstable labor market and inflation fears. Following the announcement, Chair Powell held what is likely his last press conference as Federal Reserve Chair. His term is set to end next month.
The economic outlook remains highly uncertain, and the conflict in the Middle East has added to this uncertainty. In the near term, higher energy prices will push up overall inflation. Beyond that, the scope and duration of potential effects on the economy remain unclear, as does the future course of the conflict itself.
CBS News MoneyWatch correspondent Kelly O'Grady is at the New York Stock Exchange with more. Of course, he had to fit in his favorite word, or at least it seems that way, every time we hear from him, and that is uncertainty. So first off, take us into this decision to hold rates steady.
Yeah, so this was really about the energy inflation that we've seen that was called out multiple times in the statement. You heard him say it there. I've been listening to the press conference, which is ongoing right now, but he's really talked about that as a concern. I think consumers watching this right now feel that as a concern every time they go to the gas pump. And so when you had inflation that jumped on the CPI to 3.3% last month, remember the Fed's target is 2%, and then you had a job market that has been relatively unchanged, is how Powell has put it in the presser today. The decision was sort of laid out, and that's why the market had been pricing in 100% chance that there was going to be no change. And so there's sort of that rhetoric of inflation being a concern and how long this war with Iran goes on. I'm looking at the markets. You know, we're not down 1% or anything on the Dow, but we are down over 0.5%. Investors don't love to hear that.
So what more is he saying that you think investors are taking note of?
So I think it's a couple things. I think it is this war with Iran, the concern there. I think it is also the fact that there was dissent among the committee. In fact, the most dissent that we've seen since 1992. So the decision was not unanimous. It was 8-4. Of the 4 that dissented, one wanted to actually cut interest rates 0.25%. The other 3 were fine with holding interest rates steady, but they took issue with how it was messaged. There was a line in the release where it said additional adjustments, that they would sort of, look at all the data that comes in and potentially make additional adjustments. They had issue with the word additional because it messages, it sort of signals to the market, to everyone reading this, that there might be more cuts coming. Because remember, the last move that was made, last multiple moves that were made were cuts, and they don't feel comfortable with that. So if I'm an investor, what that tells me is, there's dissent within the committee, and there's a strong group of people that don't seem on board with interest rate cuts for the foreseeable future. And as you know, investors like when it is cheaper to borrow money.
What do we hear about what Powell said about his own job?
Broke some news. He said that he plans to stay on indefinitely while the investigation into the cost overruns at the Fed is at the Inspector General's office. Remember, there was a criminal investigation at the DOJ that was dropped last week, but it was handed over to the Inspector General's office. Now, Chair Powell has the ability, once his term is done on May 15th, to stay on as a governor. It would be a voting member, so he would have one of 12 votes next interest rate decision and the ones in the future. And in fact, someone asked him in the room, I said, well, isn't that in fact a political stance to stay on? Because you know that the president doesn't like you and that you likely aren't going to be voting for interest rates depending on how the data comes in. He said, I don't see it that way. I need to stay on until this sort of whole investigation is cleared. And so he did use that word indefinitely. Doesn't mean he's going to stay on until the end of his term in 2028, but it sounds for now we will have a Chair Powell or Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve for the foreseeable future.
Okay, Kelly O'Grady, thank you.